Savoy confirmed. New names I'll use. Narrator equals I. No name needed. Grandfather equals granddad/grandpa Gil. Father equals my father. Mother equals my brother. Plus supporting characters, Rowan, attorney, Leanne, family friend/Allie, Dax, brother's name, not in list, Corbin, financial advisor. Let me write now. I want to start by saying this isn't easy to talk about. Even now, sitting in the study that used to smell like cedar and pipe tobacco, my grandfather's study, my study now, I still catch myself reaching for the phone to call him. Habit, I guess. 31 years of habit don't just stop because someone is gone. My grandfather built everything from nothing. Literally nothing. He came up from a small town in rural Georgia with $40 in his pocket and a willingness to work hours that would kill most men. He got into commercial real estate in the late 70s, then logistics, then energy infrastructure. By the time I was born, the family name carried weight in 3 states. By the time I was old enough to understand what that meant, I had already decided I didn't want any part of it. That sounds ungrateful. I know how it sounds. But when you grow up watching money turn your father into someone you don't recognize, when you see your mother justify things she never would have accepted before, there was enough of it. You start to associate wealth with a kind of rot. A slow one. The kind that doesn't smell until it's already too late. I kept my distance. I went to state school on a partial scholarship, paid the rest with loans and a part-time job at a shipping warehouse. I got my degree in civil engineering, took a job with a mid-size infrastructure firm in Charlotte, and built a quiet life. Small apartment. Used truck. 2 good friends, and a gym membership I actually used. I was 31 years old and genuinely content. My grandfather never stopped calling, every Sunday evening, 7 p.m., without fail. We'd talk for an hour, sometimes 2. He'd ask about my work, my life. I'd ask about his health, his garden. He'd taken up growing tomatoes in his 70s, which I always found funny. He was a man who once negotiated a $40 million land acquisition over lunch, and in retirement he was most proud of a Cherokee Purple that came in at nearly 2 pounds. He never talked about the will. Not once in all those calls. He never said a word about what he was planning. I found out the way everyone finds out about things that change their life, without any warning at all. He passed on a Tuesday in October. Cardiac event, the doctor said. Fast. He was 83 years old and had been healthy right up until he wasn't. My mother called me at 6 in the morning and I was in my truck and driving before she finished the sentence. The funeral was that Friday. Half the county showed up. Business associates, old neighbors, men he'd mentored 40 years ago who had built their own empires and still called him sir. I stood at the edge of it all and watched my father work the room like it was a networking event. Firm handshakes, practiced condolences, the right amount of grief in his voice at the right moments. My brother stood with him, dressed identically, operating identically. He was 35, 4 years older than me, and he had spent his entire adult life positioning himself as the heir apparent to everything my grandfather had built. He worked for my grandfather's holding company. He sat on 2 of the subsidiary boards. He had a house 12 minutes from my grandfather's estate. I had not been invited to any of it, and I had not asked to be. The reading of the will was set for the Monday after the funeral, at the offices of my grandfather's attorney. I almost didn't go. It felt intrusive, somehow, like I'd be showing up to claim something I had no stake in. But my grandfather's personal assistant, a woman named Leanne who had worked for him for 22 years and who I liked enormously, called me Saturday night and said, quietly but firmly, that I needed to be there, that my grandfather had specifically asked her to make sure I came. I drove up Sunday night, stayed at a motel off the interstate rather than at the family house. My father had already made it clear, in the way he made most things clear, not by saying them directly, but by the particular quality of his silence, that my presence at the estate was tolerated rather than welcomed. The attorney's name was Rowan. He was somewhere in his late 50s, gray at the temples, unhurried in the way of someone who has sat through enough of these rooms to know that speed doesn't help anyone. There were 5 of us around the table, my father, my mother, my brother, me, and Leanne, who was there as a witness. Rowan set a folder on the table, opened it without ceremony, and began to read. My grandfather had left his personal belongings, his cars and the family residence to my father. He left a generous financial gift to Leanne and to several long-time employees. He left specific parcels of land to a conservation trust he'd established years ago. And then Rowan said my name. He said I had been named sole beneficiary of the primary estate trust, the holding company, the investment portfolio, the commercial properties, the liquid assets, all of it. The total value, as of the most recent appraisal, was just under $240 million. I don't remember the exact moment the room went quiet. I remember that it did. I remember that my brother's chair scraped back hard against the floor and my father's hand went flat on the table. I remember my mother made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I remember that I couldn't feel my hands. Rowan kept going. He read a personal letter my grandfather had written, to be read aloud at this exact moment. It said, and I'm paraphrasing because I couldn't write it down fast enough, and my memory of those minutes is not clean, that he had watched me for 31 years make choices that had nothing to do with his money, that I had asked nothing from him, taken nothing, build my own life without leaning on his name. That he had made his decision not out of punishment to anyone else, but out of trust. That he believed I would protect what he built in a way that honored where it came from. He said he was proud of me. I hadn't known that. Not like that. Not in words that formal. My father stood up before Rowan finished reading. He said this was a mistake, that there had clearly been some confusion in the final months, that my grandfather had been unwell, which was not true and everyone in the room knew it, and that the family would be consulting their own attorneys. He said it calmly, like he was declining a business proposal, rather than contesting his dead father's final wishes. My brother didn't say anything. He just stared at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since we were kids, when something I had that he wanted. My mother touched my arm on the way out. She said softly that she hoped I would do the right thing. I asked her what that meant. She said I knew what it meant. I drove back to the motel and sat in the parking lot for a long time. Then I called Leanne. She picked up on the first ring. She said, I know. She said he had told her 6 months ago what he was planning, and that he had asked her not to say anything to anyone, including me. She said she had argued with him about it, not because she thought he was wrong, but because she'd been worried about exactly what had just happened in that room. I asked her if she knew why. Why not my father? Why not my brother? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he watched them for 30 years, too. The calls started the next morning. My father called at 7. He kept his voice measured, the way he did when he was trying to appear reasonable. He said the family needed to sit down together and discuss the situation like adults. He said there were legal complexities I didn't understand, tax implications, structural obligations within the holding company that required continuity of management. He said it would be irresponsible. That word, irresponsible. For someone with no business experience to assume control of an operation this size. I told him I appreciated his concern and that I'd be speaking with Rowan before making any decisions. He called back 2 hours later. The measured voice was gone. He said that what my grandfather had done was a slap in the face to everything my father had contributed to building that company. He said he had given 30 years to that business, that he had sacrificed for it, that he deserved recognition. He said that if I had any decency, I would transfer the controlling interest to him and take a fair share for myself. Something appropriate for my level of involvement, which had been 0. I told him I needed time to think. My brother's approach was different. He texted rather than called, which told me something. The texts were long and detailed, almost like memos. He laid out a case, methodical, organized, the way he did everything, for why the transition of the holding company to me would be damaging to the employees, the portfolio companies, the stakeholders. He said he wasn't asking for himself. He was asking for the people whose jobs depended on stability. I read every word. I didn't respond right away. Then my mother came to see me in person. She drove to the motel. She must have gotten the address from my father's phone, or from my brother, I'm not sure. She knocked on my door at 9 in the evening and stood in the doorway looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. She said she didn't want to fight. She said she just wanted me to understand what it would mean for the family if I held on to something I'd never worked for. I wanted to be honest about this part. That one almost got me, not because the argument was right, but because she looked like my mother in that moment, not like a negotiator. She looked like a woman who was genuinely afraid of what would happen to her life. I asked her to come in. We sat at the small table by the window, and I told her I wasn't going to make any decisions in a week, that I was going to learn what my grandfather had actually built before I decided anything, and that I would not be signing over anything to anyone. I said that as gently as I could. I also said that if my father called me irresponsible again, I was going to stop taking his calls. She left without saying much. At the door, she paused and said, "He always loved you best, you know. Ever since you were small. I just never understood why that meant the rest of us had to lose. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't really." The next week was the strangest of my life. I met with Rowan 3 times. I met with my grandfather's financial director, a quiet, precise man named Corbin who had been managing the portfolio for 11 years and spent 2 full days going through the structure of the trust. I learned things about my grandfather's business that I'd never known. The scale of it, the care he had taken to make it sustainable, to build in protections, to document his reasoning. There were notes everywhere, in the margins of reports, in emails, in a private journal Rowan gave me that covered the last 5 years of decisions. He had been preparing for this for a long time. He hadn't made this decision in his final months. He had made it years ago, and he had built the whole structure of the trust around it. There was something in the journal I wasn't expecting. He wrote about my father with more sadness than anger. He wrote that he had tried for years to understand what had happened to the man his son had become. He wrote about specific moments. A deal my father had structured in a way that hurt long-term partners to maximize a short-term gain. A disagreement over a piece of property that ended with my grandfather walking away from a relationship he'd had for 20 years because my father had handled it wrong and wouldn't acknowledge it. He wrote, "I kept hoping he would come back to himself. He never did." He wrote about my brother differently. Shorter entries, colder. He wrote that my brother had my father's instincts, without my father's occasional flashes of conscience. He wrote, "He will be fine. He has always known how to land on his feet. He does not need this." And then there was one entry, dated about 3 years ago, that just said my name in 2 sentences. "He has no idea I'm watching." That's exactly why I trust him. I sat with that for a long time. Here is the part of this story that I haven't told many people. About 10 days after the reading, Leanne called me and said there was something I needed to know. She said she had been waiting to tell me because she wasn't sure it was her place, but she couldn't hold it any longer. She said that 2 weeks before my grandfather died, 2 weeks while he was still alive, while I was still getting Sunday evening calls, my brother had met privately with a real estate investment group out of Atlanta. Without my grandfather's knowledge, he had presented himself as the likely successor to the trust and had discussed the potential sale of 3 properties from the portfolio. Properties that were not his to discuss. Leanne had found out through a contact in Atlanta who knew my grandfather and had been confused enough by the meeting to reach out quietly. My grandfather never knew. He died before she could figure out how to tell him. I asked her if she had documentation. She said she had emails forwarded to her by the Atlanta contact. She sent them to me that afternoon. I read them twice. Then I forwarded them to Rowan. I called my brother that evening. I didn't tell him what I had. I just asked him, directly, if there was anything he wanted to tell me about the weeks before Granddad died. He said no. No hesitation, no pause. Just no. I told him I understood. I went back to Charlotte 2 weeks after the reading. I had spoken with Corbin and Rowan enough to have a basic understanding of what I was responsible for, and I negotiated a 60-day period before I had to make any structural decisions. I had arranged for Corbin to continue in his role. He was relieved to stay. I think he'd been worried, and I'd asked Rowan to be in touch with my father's attorneys when they filed whatever they were going to file. They filed. Of course they did. A challenge to the will on the grounds of undue influence, alleging that my relationship with my grandfather had been used to manipulate an elderly man. The filing was detailed and expensive and went nowhere. My grandfather had been meticulous. He had a psychiatric evaluation on file from 8 months before his death. He had 2 witnesses to the signing of the trust documents who had no relationship to our family. He had anticipated exactly this. When the challenge was dismissed, my father did not call me. My brother did not call me. My mother sent a text that said, "I hope you're well." I replied, "I hope you are too." I'm not going to pretend the silence after that didn't hurt. It did. There's something uniquely heavy about a family that goes quiet. Not because the argument is over, but because there's nothing left to argue about. They didn't lose me because of the money. They lost me because of what the money revealed about what had always been true. A few months later, I made two decisions about the trust. The first was a donation, significant, not symbolic, to a workforce development nonprofit that operates in the same rural counties where my grandfather grew up. He had talked about it in one of his journal entries. He'd wanted to do it for years, but had gotten tangled up in internal disagreements about the right structure. I untangled it. Corbin said it was the cleanest thing he'd seen come out of the trust in a decade. The second was about my brother and the Atlanta meeting. I had thought about this for a long time, whether to pursue it legally, whether to confront him publicly, whether to simply let it go. In the end, I forwarded the emails to the boards of the two subsidiary companies he sat on and let them make their own decisions. I didn't editorialize. I didn't write a cover note. I just sent the documentation and let it speak for itself. One board asked him to resign. The other put him on a formal performance review. I didn't follow up. I still go to Charlotte on weekends sometimes. My apartment there is small and familiar, and nothing in it reminds me of inheritance or attorneys or family members who smile differently, depending on what they want from you. My truck is the same truck. The gym membership is still active. On Sunday evenings at 7 p.m., for about 3 months after my grandfather died, I kept my phone close, not expecting a call. Just close. Habit, like I said. Then one Sunday I was in the estate study, going through another box of his papers, and I found a postcard he'd written and never sent. It was addressed to me and my Charlotte apartment. No stamp, no date. It said, "The tomatoes came in well this year. Wish you'd been here to see them. Come soon. Granddad." I put it on the desk. It's still there, right next to the window that looks out over the garden where the tomato beds are still growing. Tended now by the same groundskeeper who tended them when he was alive. On Sunday evenings, sometimes, I go out and check on them. Not because I know anything about growing tomatoes, because it's something to do at 7 p.m. when the phone doesn't ring. And because standing in that garden is about as close as I can get now to a conversation I would give a lot to have one more time. I keep the lights on in the study late. I read his notes. I try to understand what he built and why and what he meant for it to become. I'm not the person he thought I was. Not yet. But I think he knew that too, and he decided to trust me with it anyway. That's the thing about being chosen by someone who really knew you. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like a weight you carry carefully, because you understand exactly who put it in your hands. I thought a lot about why my grandfather made the choice he made. Not because I doubt it. I stopped doubting it the day I read his journal. But because understanding it feels like the only way to carry it properly. He didn't choose me because I was the smartest person in the room. He didn't choose me because I had proven myself in business or built something impressive or outperformed my brother on any measurable scale. He chose me because of what I hadn't done. Because I hadn't reached for something that wasn't mine. Because for 31 years, I had simply lived like the money didn't exist, and it genuinely hadn't. Not in my daily life, not in the choices I made, not in the way I saw myself. That sounds simple. It isn't. There's a kind of discipline in that, a quiet one, that I didn't even know I was practicing. You don't decide once to be that way. You decide it over and over, in small moments, when it would be easier not to. When you could make a call and ask for something, when you could drop a name and open a door. I never did, partly out of pride, partly because I genuinely didn't want what came attached to it. But the accumulation of those small decisions, that's what he saw. That's what he trusted. My father never understood that. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I watched him operate for 30 years on the belief that proximity to wealth was the same thing as deserving it. He had been near my grandfather's money his entire adult life, and somewhere along the way he confused nearness with ownership. My brother made the same mistake, just more deliberately. He didn't wait to inherit. He started behaving like he already had, negotiating assets that weren't his to discuss, positioning himself for a future he assumed was guaranteed. What happened to both of them was not punishment in any dramatic sense. It was just consequence. The natural result of building your identity around something that was never yours to begin with. When it didn't come, there was nothing underneath to fall back on. That's the thing about integrity. You can't borrow it at the last minute. You either have it in the account or you don't. And no amount of legal maneuvering or family pressure can manufacture it retroactively. Leanne told me once, after everything settled down, That my grandfather used to say the hardest thing about wealth wasn't earning it. It was finding someone you trusted to carry it forward without being changed by it. He spent decades watching people get changed. He watched my father get changed. He decided quietly and without announcement that I hadn't been. Not yet. I think about that on hard days. The days when the responsibility feels heavier than I expected. When I second-guess a decision or feel the weight of all those employees and properties and obligations that now carry my name. On those days, I go back to something basic. Do the next right thing, not the profitable thing, not the strategic thing, the right one. He left me notes on almost every major decision he ever made, and the through line in all of them was that same standard. Simple to say, hard to hold. Resilience isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the work anyway, even when you weren't asked and nobody's watching. I spent years doing exactly that. Not because I was building toward anything, not because I knew this moment was coming. Just because it was the kind of person I wanted to be. Turns out that's enough. Turns out, sometimes, that's everything.